Living under rules for conflict prevention and resolution, we can address some of our needs and weaknesses, both intermittent and comparative. By living under rules for cooperation, we can address others of our needs. Such rules of cooperation require rules for coordination, like, I'll see you for coffee tomorrow. I promised you we'll have coffee tomorrow. I've committed myself, created an obligation to go for coffee tomorrow. I promised my wife sexual exclusivity. I've behaved all my life. To prevent conflict and enable compliance with cooperation and coordination rules, we need sympathy and imagination. These enable understanding and the prediction of the reactions and actions of others. An awful lot of moral error consists in failing to imagine what it's like to be in a certain situation. So you gaily do things in relation to other people, which if you showed a little sympathy and imagination, you would recognize are causing them enormous misery. Both for individual physical health and for group physical health, we need various rules governing eating, copulation, and interactive practices. You could call these purity rules. Religions are full of purity rules. You look at the early books of the Judeo-Christian Bible, you'll see it's full of purity rules. But they're basically uninformed people's attempts to preserve health, individual and group. So that's the human predicament, the lessons we can learn from this. Over the centuries, there have been many versions developed, systems of rules designed to ameliorate the human predicament. They show similarities, for they're picked out as moral, as opposed to other kinds of rules, as rules whose function is to ameliorate the human predicament. And though there are variations in the predicament in different times and places, there are great similarities. The predicament is pretty constant across time, but not completely constant. Think of the effects of contraceptives on the sexual mores that are needed to preserve health. Thirdly, various different accounts of how in detail to spell out what's to count as amelioration of the human predicament can be spelled out. For each conception of amelioration of the human predicament, various different systems of moral rules could be developed. We can assess systems of moral rules as a function of logical, empirical, and metaphysical mistakes they make. And they make many, and have made many over the years. And we can assess them as a function of how well they do in ameliorating the human predicament on each conception of that. Systems of moral rules need to be revised and updated in the light of scientific, medical, political, scientific, psychological, economic, and industrial developments, obviously. Now we come to some really big lessons. Which moralities are reasonable or acceptable is indeed in part a function of facts of various sorts, but there's no one single correct morality. That is, there's no one single system of rules that will ameliorate the human predicament. Instead, for any given time, there can be more than one reasonable or acceptable morality. This is not relativism, this is pluralism, which is very different from relativism. Relativism says that an act is right if it's accepted in your community. Relativism is a version of what's also called conventionalism. Pluralism says there's more than one way of living a moral life. Hence, if moral realism, and I take Greg to be a moral realist, thinks that there's one single morality, he's wrong. But there are really big puzzles untouched by today's debate, and they probably won't be touched by today's debate. I thought it would be useful to mention them. How best people can have adopted or subscribed to some acceptable morality, figure out that they morally ought to relate to people who've adopted a different and equally acceptable morality. That's a terrible sentence. Let me say it in a different words. I come with a different morality probably from most of you. I'm an atheist, right? I'm a social democrat, sort of Tommy Douglas social democrat. A whole bunch of you are going to be right-wing Albertans who think that people are responsible for their own well-being. I think that there's a public good that should be protected by the public out of taxes. I'm in favour of taxes. You're probably not. I think you have a moral duty to pay taxes. Many of you probably don't. So we differ. What we need are some procedures by which we can relate to one another with our different moral conceptions. The American philosopher John Rawls calls this the need for an overlapping consensus. Very important idea that he had. Secondly, another question. How can we figure out whether people who've adopted a different morality not only have different views about how we ought to behave, but also have adopted a morality which is in some sense unacceptable? I believe that Hitler adopted a morality that was grossly unacceptable. I also believe that various anti-abortion activists have adopted moralities that are grossly unacceptable. Moreover, I believe that various other people who have taken stances in relation to securing their views of how society should be run and use violence to secure their goals have also adopted unacceptable moralities. So I need to distinguish between the case where there's just a different morality and the case where there's an unacceptable morality. Very important distinction. Another really big puzzle that won't be touched by today's debate is, given there are some ameliorations can go beyond mere amelioration of the human predicament into making life good or better than good, how do we go about addressing the question of what lives, though satisfactory or even good, are nevertheless less good than others? So how do you figure out which lives are better than others? I mean, better lives to live, not morally better, but more fulfilling and rewarding lives. That's a very tricky question. It's not a moral question, but there are moral overtones and moral issues related to it. It's a different question. And finally here, how consistently, with some acceptable morality, can we secure compliance with some maybe different morality by people who are either weak of will, rash, or just plain non-compliance? How do we deal with misbehavior? There are moral limits to the ways in which you should or can deal with misbehavior. Our current Conservative government seems to have lost track of the moral constraints of what's appropriate in dealing with misbehavior, for example. So what I want to suggest is that moral realism is simply not plausible for various reasons, including two very famous ones. First of all, this famous reason is the so-called argument from moral diversity. I've already outlined most of it. There are a variety of equally reasonable, rational, and well-grounded ways of living, systems of morality. And the fact that there are such different ones, and that over the years different moralities have developed, should suggest to us that there isn't a single morality that we should be expecting ourselves to converge on over the generations. And the second argument is the so-called argument from queerness. It's a very, very famous argument, but I'll hold that one. And anticipation, I hope, anticipate my using it later on.